It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and here to talk about St. Ignatius and his book on the Ignatian Way, a pilgrimage in the footsteps of St. Ignatius of Loyola, is Chris Lowney. Thanks so much for being here, Chris.
That's my great pleasure. Thanks for the chance.
Do you have a favorite Ignatius quote?
Oh, man. You kind of put me on the spot with that. I don't, but here's what I would say.
Okay.
One of the great mantras of the Jesuits is that, and Ignatius Loyola founded the Jesuits in the middle of the 16th century. One of the great mantras is that Jesuits needed to be contemplatives even in action. And I think that's why, in some ways, he's a very useful, quote-unquote, or a very resonant saint for those of us in the chaotic 21st century. You know, because we're living these nutty lives, floating along in this tide of text and email, meeting, phone call. We're all distracted. The world pulls us in all these different directions. And so I think our challenge is the challenge that he tried to articulate in building his spirituality for the Jesuits, namely, how are people going to manage to stay recollected, to understand what's important, and so on in the midst of their really chaotic lives.
So how do you do that personally?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you what he recommends, which I try to do. And, you know, some days I do well and other days I don't do very well at all. But the beauty of life is each day gives a new opportunity. Ignatius suggests to Jesuits, and by extension to the rest of us, that every day we ought to think about taking a couple of little mental pit stops. My word. He used the word examine. So let's imagine once after lunch and the other at the end of the day. And, okay, I have 5 or 10 minutes after lunch. I'm going to turn off my phone, no music, no social media, no nothing. I'm just going to be with myself. And I'm going to remind myself, why am I grateful as a human being? I'm going to try to recall my sense of purpose as a Christian, as a person. And I'm going to go back through the last few hours, the day so far, revisiting the situations I was in, the people I was with, and try to take away some little lesson that might help me in the next few hours. In other words, if I was not as my best self, what was going on, and could I resolve to make amends to whoever I might have hurt and kind of better orient myself to the rest of the day. Or another way to put it would be, let me try to go back over the last few hours and perceive how God was present to me, or trying to be present to me in the people I met, the situations I was in, and so on.
It seems like a lot, if not all of your books, have something to do with St. Ignatius and his influence that he's had on you. How did that begin? Where did your interest in St. Ignatius start? So
I went to a Jesuit high school, and then I myself was a Jesuit seminarian for a few years. So right after high school, I went into the Jesuits. And then when I discerned that my proper path in the world as a Catholic and a Christian was not as a priest, I ended up working at J.P. Morgan, which is what some people would consider quite a dramatic change. But anyway, I was fortunate enough to work at J.P. Morgan for about 17 years, including in time in Asia and Europe and so on. So I had two very different pieces of my life. And, you know, in a way, I felt like working at J.P. Morgan, I appreciated Jesuit spirituality and Ignatius and so on in a more powerful way than when, believe it or not, than when I was a Jesuit seminarian myself. You know, because I could kind of see how durable and relevant this way of praying, this spirituality was in the active world that we're all trying to live and work in. So, yeah, I mean, it's, you know, the influence on me is obviously rooted in my own formation, you know, as somebody who was a Jesuit, a seminarian, but filtered through the world of work that many of us are trying to make headway in.
So for those that don't know a lot about St. Ignatius, how would you describe him or set the scene for us?
Yeah, maybe I'll give you the 1-minute story, which will also include a quick summary to how the book took the shape it's taken. He was a Spaniard, minor noble, soldier. His plan A for life was to be, you know, a knight, so to speak. And that plan A was shattered when he had a leg shattered by a cannonball in a battle. He ends up at home, and in the course of a long convalescence, has a deep conversion experience. And as the first step of his new phase of life, trying to figure out where God might want him to serve, he ends up going on a pilgrimage. His ultimate objective is the Holy Land, but he travels first from his home in one part of Spain to Montserrat and Manresa, which are famous shrines now in another part of Spain. And let me fast forward. He ends up founding the Jesuits, which would be just about the largest religious order in the Catholic world today, active in certainly more than 100 countries and famous to many of us as educators in high schools and colleges and so on. Now, the book takes as its jumping off point that pilgrimage I just described, where he left his home. He went almost 500 miles to those shrines, and a team of us has recreated a pilgrim trail along that route he walked. And the book includes accounts from almost a dozen people about their pilgrimages, not necessarily like a travel log, this is what I saw, but more what was going on inside me when I made this journey. So, in a way, the book maybe is highly relevant, certainly for people who might actually think about doing a pilgrimage like that for themselves, but also, and maybe even more so, for folks like, I guess, many of our listeners, for whom their journey won't physically be, I'm going to go trek across Spain, but rather, okay, let me commit a little time to doing an inner prayerful journey and take account of my life and where I'm going, and do that maybe in the way that Ignatius recommends and lays out.
We're talking with Chris Lowney. The book is On the Ignatian Way, a pilgrimage in the footsteps of St. Ignatius of Loyola. And what would be the breakup, would you say, between it being a physical pilgrimage, talking about different locations and the influence that they've had on Christianity, and how much of it is the spiritual way of St. Ignatius? There's
another book out there that's more like a travel guide coaching book, to help people with this is where I go, this is what I do, and so on. The book that you and I are talking about, On the Ignatian Way, was really put together to focus exclusively on the spiritual part of the journey. So there's a little bit of an introduction to St. Ignatius and his life and his ideas about praying. Then there are these accounts from a number of pilgrims, and of course they may reference this is, where I went or something I saw, but really they're focusing on the graces that they got out of their journey. In other words, one talks about, how beautiful gratitude for the beauty of the world, for the gift that he himself is able to do something like this. And another person, the grace was a feeling of great closeness with Jesus, and a deep understanding that Jesus is always accompanying him all during life. So the middle part of the book is accounts by a number of folks of the graces they got from this experience. And then the last part of the book invites folks to do a series of reflections. They could do it over the course of a month, to do their own inner prayerful journey in the style of St. Ignatius. I mean, the work he's most famous for is what's often called the spiritual exercises, a program of guided meditations that are core to every Jesuit's formation and are probably the most widely used retreat tool in the Catholic world today. So the third part of the book literally invites people to go on their own prayerful journey in the style of St. Ignatius by doing a version of these spiritual exercises.
And what do you think are some of the advantages of the Ignatius Way versus some of the other ways to approach spiritual growth?
That's a hard question, only in the sense of I certainly don't want to imply better and worse. Okay. I feel like each of the great traditions in the church have their own gifts, and some of those gifts maybe are very relevant for my life, not so much for yours, or might be relevant at this moment in my life and as opposed to others. But having said that, having given that caveat, I think the two things I might focus on as being especially valuable and powerful in the approach of Ignatius is, one, he places a lot of emphasis on decision-making. He uses the word discernment. In other words, how do we, whether it's choosing relationships or jobs or what to do with our money or how to navigate an important moment in my life with a child or a loved one, how do we go about making choices in a way that, of course, is informed by facts, but that also is prayerful and guided by the Holy Spirit. So that would be one thing I would say, that his spirituality really highlights how we become discerning people who are good at making decisions. And the other thing I might say that I think is a particular emphasis of his spirituality might be summed up in another mantra the Jesuits use a lot: finding God in all things. And so a big emphasis of Ignatius is, of course, God is in the church when we attend Mass and when we sit before the tabernacle, but we also believe that God's presence is in each person and in every situation we come across, and that's a big emphasis of his, trying to develop the awareness of that. And just by the way, let me mention those who follow the Holy Father closely. He often talks about these kinds of ideas, about being good decision makers, discerning people, about finding God in all places, in the peripheries. And that's no accident, of course, because the Holy Father himself is a Jesuit. This is,
right,
so to speak, the spiritual Kool-Aid that he drank, in the course of his own formation as a young seminarian and priest.
Uh-huh. What is it about St. Ignatius and his spiritual exercises that makes it still relevant, centuries later?
Well, I think it's precisely that it's a spirituality for people who are active in the world. I think that's one thing. And secondly, that it's a spirituality that's very much about decision-making. To give 20 seconds of history, when the Jesuits were founded, many religious orders are what we today would call monastic. In other words, where people, lived in a monastery, they prayed together multiple times each day, and that's a wonderful vocation that we still have in the church. But Ignatius' idea was to have a much more activist religious order. They'd be out in the world as teachers and so on, and so they wouldn't have the walls of the monastery, so to speak, to keep them recollected and focused. And so I often say to people, I feel like Ignatius had to solve the problem that all of us nurses, teachers, parents, business people, and so on have to solve. Namely, how do you keep a grip on your sense of focus, your sense of purpose, your recollection, your spirituality in the midst of whatever work you're doing all day? Mm-hmm. So that, I think it's precisely because he was creating a spirituality with active Jesuits in mind. That's why I think his spirituality has, remained very relevant in these very hectic, busy times in which we're all trying to live and work.
Yeah. Well, where's the best place to get a copy of the book and learn more about you and the other books that you've written?
Okay, so thanks for asking that. The book is by Ignatius Press, and of course, folks can go to their website and find it. Absolutely, folks can go to Amazon and find it. And I'm always happy to hear from anybody who wants to learn more or engage on some of the things I've written and so on. And my own website is just my name as one word. So chrislowney.com, ChrisLowney.com. And I'm always very happy to hear from folks and engage with them.
All right, great. Again, the book is called On the Ignatian Way, A Pilgrimage in the Footsteps of St. Ignatius of Loyola. Thanks so much, Chris, for joining us today and sharing this with us.
That's my great pleasure. Thanks for the chance to be with you and your listeners.